गुड इवनिंग एवरीवन। मेरा नाम याशवी राठौड़ है। मैं मेरे फाइनल ईयर में हूँ। आई एम स्टडीइंग इंटरनेशनल स्टडीज इन जर्नलिज्म विद like a specialization in public policy also at Flame University here in Pune. And for my final year dissertation topic, I chose to sort of understand the aesthetic representations of media about the partition through the lens of Indian and Pakistani media. So I think that's why all of us are here, and I'm really excited कि आप लोग सब मेरा काम देख सके। और I'm sorry मेरी हिंदी while talking about research इतनी correct नहीं है। मेरी मेरे को उर्दू and Hindi are pretty similar, but it's not as fluent. So excuse me if I keep changing the way I
ओके
talk,
ओके,
but
कोई इशू नहीं। अच्छा
I'll
याशवी,
try my best.
याशवी याशवी एक काम करें प्रेजेंटेशन शुरू करने से पहले। एक तो ये
हाँ।
बताएं कि आपका जो नाम है उसको मैं ठीक प्रोनाउंस कर रहा हूँ, या आप खुद बता दें कि हाउ टू प्रोनाउंस याशवी, और इसके मीनिंग भी बता दें।
Acha. So my name is Yashvi. I mean, I don't have any specification with how it's pronounced, so anything is fine. Or I mean, it means that you're famous and you kind of bring in good luck. I mean, that's what सब जन मेरे घर पे बोल के मैं बड़ी हुई हूँ. तो I think yeah.
ठीक, ओके। तो अब आप कीजिए बात जो आपका है, एस्थेटिक रिप्रेजेंटेशन ऑफ पार्टीशन। जबरदस्त, वेलकम। जी जी
ठीक है.
याशवी,
Okay.
ओवर टू यू।
I'm just gonna start presenting it. Is my screen visible?
हाँ बिल्कुल, आ रही है, आ रही है।
ठीक है. Okay. Cool. Good evening, everybody. My name is Yashvi, and today I'm going to be talking about my thesis defense, जो कि aesthetic representations of Partition 1947 through the Indian lens and the Pakistani lens of media. I'm going to be speaking about that. Before I get into anything, I'd really like to thank my faculty mentor who's also here. I obviously everyone knows her, but her name is Professor Saloni Kapoor, and whatever I've done has been because of her help and because of me constantly going to her with different realizations about the partition. So I really like to thank her for being so supportive through the entire process of the paper. Um, so before I get into anything, I'd like to sort of declare a positionality statement. Essentially, what this does is just sort of declares the fact that I'm actually from India, and a lot of what I think, a lot of what I sort of process is done because India has certain perspectives. I've grown up around certain perspectives, and पिछले कई महीनों में मैंने ट्राई किया है कि मैं एक्टिवली एंगेज कर सकूं दूसरी चीजें सीखने में. And I have strived to develop a more comprehensive and unbiased perspective on the partition. But at the end of the day, I still belong from a family that wasn't as affected by the partition. My family is Rajasthani. We belong to the Indian state of Rajasthan, but all my life I've lived in the southern and the western parts of India, where the history of the partition is relatively alienated from. I mean, down south in India, partition के बारे में बात भी नहीं होती है इतनी because बिल्कुल इफेक्ट नहीं किया था उस रीजन को. तो yeah, and having said all of this, if any of the comments I make, if any part of my work is sort of misrepresented or oversimplified, I really like to apologize for that, because most of it is going to be from the lens of what I have sort of been brought up to, because that's how my gaze with things work. But whether it is intentional or unintentional. I'm really sorry for that, and I'm obviously open to contrasting viewpoints and thoughtful discussions that can help me deepen my understanding on the partition in any way possible. So to start off with, the partition is one of the most it's one of it's the life-changing event of South Asia in a lot of ways, and there are a lot of estimates on the number of people, on the number of casualties that happened, on the number of people that were affected. There is a lot of work that's been done on that's been done on sort of collecting real data, but the thing is, none of these estimates can be trusted because a lot of things are also undocumented. That itself explains the extent of partition as a concept. Um, yeah, to give like a rough estimate, I'd say that around 12 to 18 million people sort of moved eastwards and westwards during the partition. And the 1951 Pakistani census lists that around 72.26 lakh migrants from India went on the other side. And the Indian census says that around 72.95 lakh people migrated from Pakistan. The numbers are very broad, and the interesting part about the kind of data that's been collected off the partition itself is that the nature in which it sort of evolves is very interesting. So, for
यशवी यशवी बेटा अनम्यूट करें, यशवी अनम्यूट करें।
sorry,
जी जी।
sir, am I
हाँ
audible?
हाँ, यस यस यस।
अच्छा, कब तक अनम्यूटेड था?
ये अभी
Should
अभी
I
हुआ था,
just
ये
continue?
बाय
ठीक है.
मिस्टेक मुझसे ही हुआ था।
Okay, sure. Yeah. So as I was saying, there was research that came out by the Harvard Center for Population and Developmental Studies that said that instead of the assumed sort of estimate that they had, around 14.5 million people who they thought had moved from country to country in previous estimates, they realized that the actual number was 18 million. I mean, there was a speculation that 18 million people would have moved, and around 2.3 to 3.2 million people just died in the violence. What my whole point with introducing so many numbers in my introduction is the fact that the event was at such a large scale that even estimating the number of casualties itself is such a big question mark. So it's interesting because अगर इसी बात पे इतना डिबेट हो रहा है तो the way people think of the partition उसमें कितने सारे complexities और layers हो सकते हैं. So the whole point of me introducing those numbers was that. So moving on to the theory that I sort of used for this. So I used a theory by Roland Bleicher, who's a scholar in international studies, who basically argues that you know the way people take challenges, the way people sort of respond to political challenges, the way people sort of respond to the way people sort of respond um, to um, to a conflict or to a war or to a genocide is driven by emotions, right? So what this theory essentially does is that it challenges the conventional notion that politics as a concept is purely rational and material. So there's another scholar called Shapiro who sort of adds to this, and वो क्या बोल रहे हैं कि ग्लोबल इवेंट्स में जो भी चीजें होती है the sensory and the interpretative experiences are very similar. So what they're essentially trying to say is that जो political realities है, that's just not about policies and power. They're also about how we feel, how we remember, and how we sort of represent them. So um, like I mentioned before, even diplomatic relations are sort of shaped by artistic and cultural narratives. Then this might range from paintings and literature to public memorials. So the way people perceive things is completely subjective to how they have been brought up. Um, Coming to, I mean, if you were to apply this theory to the partition, you might come on and realize that the traditional analysis that's sort of done on the partition does focus on the technicalities of it, so the territorial disputes and the political negotiations. But um, if you were to take an aesthetic approach, that approach might ask, how do films, novels, and oral histories shape the way people sort of engage with the partition? Like, for example, cultural representations don't only preserve memory, but they also sort of influence the present day Indian and Pakistani relations. So, um, in a lot of ways, this process is also called the aestheticization of trauma, which can both heal and also deepen divisions by shaping national identities and public discourse. So, before I get into the literature review, I'd also like to mention the fact that the partition has been particularly difficult to sort of represent because both in historical writing and through the arts there are different fronts, right? There are, I mean, some people might argue that there are two different fronts, but मेरा argument वो होगा कि इतनी complexities के बाद obviously the way people sort of want their front to be is going to be very different, because it's going to be very regional and it's going to be very contextual. So it doesn't even come down to India versus Pakistan. It comes down to let's say like a regional, like a region in the Indian Punjab, or like a region in the Pakistani Punjab. So I feel like the way people sort of look at पार्टीशन इज, आई मीन, सबसे बड़ी गलतफहमी यही है कि पार्टीशन को दो नजरियों से देखा जाता है, बट whereas काफी काफी different sort of perspectives also sort of emerge. So moving on to the literature review for the paper. So I did try tracking the evolution of the narratives and the evolution of the kind of literature that the kind of media sources that sort of tried to sort of emerge. So the early narratives primarily focused on the immediate violence and trauma that was associated with the event. So, for example, Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan sort of portrays the brutal realities that were faced by people during the partition, and also it emphasizes the themes of alienation and loss. Moving on to Sadat Hassan Manto, again, he's done a lot of work on short stories, and he's captured like the moral dilemmas and the chaos that was sort of experienced during the time. But but again, the kind of things that they ended up focusing on was still very, very immediate, because the wounds were so fresh, right? So the early narratives did sort of only speak about the regions, like Punjab and Bengal, because both of them were because both of these areas were the most affected. So moving on from the 1950s, the focus sort of shifted from the immediate violence. It sort of, I mean, obviously, the violence was important because it sort of shaped the way, people looked at the partition, because and a lot of their trauma was sort of associated to the immediate violence. But these stories also sort of focused on personal loss. It focused on memory. It focused on survival rather than the concept of the large scale violence itself. Because अगर आप large scale violence को देखोगे तो उसको उसको देखने का नजरिया काफी broad होगा. So if you really want to dig deep, and if you really want to understand personal experiences, you need to get down to survival, because survival for everyone is very different, right? So again, stories about people left behind, changing identities and struggles also kind of belong to this sort of evolution. So a very good example for this can be Cracking India, which is also a book called Ice Candy Man, is written by Bapsi Sidhwa, who is a Parsi that belonged to Lahore and witnessed the partition. So the most interesting part about the book was that it was sort of captured through the eye of a very young child. I think it kind of questions a lot of things that even adults can't question. So in that way, the media kind of became more it became more diverse in a lot of ways. Okay, and like I said, Cracking India and Ice Candy Man are the same book, and this was just one sort of example from the literature review. But again, the books that I've mentioned here were the books that stood out the most to me. So, in contrast to what I said about Manto, the contemporary narratives often explored themes of hybrid identity and resilience. So एक book जो काफी interesting लगी मुझे, it's called Salt and Saffron by Camilla Shamsies, which sort of engaged with current issues like nationalism, and kind of draws parallels from historic events of the partition. So that was very interesting. And sort of moving on to another book, which is also very, which was also something that stood out to me, was Abdullah Hussein's novel, The Weary Generation, which sort of presents an alternative perspective that critiques and questions the glorification of independence by addressing the violence and the trauma that has been associated to it. So, like another discourse that has come out is questioning the very meaning of the partition, and questioning whether all of the losses, all of the trauma that has been associated with it was even worth it in the first place. So what this does is that it reflects on a broader trend in literature and media, not just the historical realities of the partition, but it also questions the ongoing implications for the identity and belonging in a relatively globalized world. Um, Moving on to a more sort of mainstream perspective on the partition, there are a lot of films and dramas that sort of use costumes and sets and flashbacks to kind of recreate the past, because in a lot of ways these representations are the only thing we have left that can come very close to the representation of the partition. So, a very interesting show that stood out to me was Dastan, because it covers everything. So it starts off with sort of placing in the view of Ludhiana, and after that you see how everything was fine. Like, you see that India and Pakistan were the same, and Punjab as a state had so much belonging to its people and to everyone. So and after that you see the violence, and uske baad you see that this girl has been put through so much. It kind of revolves around the life of the main character. Her name is Sanam Baloch, but her name in the series is Bano. So what happens is that she's put through so much ki, that she becomes numb to the pain. So after that, after a lot of hindrances, she kind of escapes from the Indian Punjab to Rawalpindi. So what you see is her struggle. She was forcefully converted into being a Sikh. She was raped. She had to give birth to a Sikh son, which was done without her consent. So after that, you go on to see that she finally makes it back to Rawalpindi. But her idea of Pakistan when she was fighting for it pre-partition and her idea of Pakistan post-partition was so different that it completely destroyed her mentally. So you kind of go on to realize the impact that people had after the partition also, and this particular show really stood out to me because it kind of captures everything in one go. And again, different regions have different stories. So with Punjab, it's violence and religious conflict because it kind of was the epicenter of the way the partition broke out. And with Bengal, it was more different because there were stories of loss, there were stories of longing, and there was also this fight to hold on to language and culture because of how much the place has been put through, because there was another partition that Bengal had to kind of go through before the Indo-Pak partition. So another area that's not represented enough in history is Sindh. So this sort of highlights the exile. This sort of looks at Hindu-Muslim friendships and the struggle to keep the Sindhi identity alive. Of course, there are people who kind of consume media on both ends, which sort of shows how culture survives despite division. I feel like this forum of Mukalma itself is such a big victory because it shows how the human to human connection is so important when it comes to understanding the partition. So yeah. What still needs to be studied, in my view, was new ways of remembering the partition. So, social media has become a place where people are connecting despite their identities. Musicians and artists use their work to call unity between India and Pakistan, which is something that throws us in the light of the idea of questioning the partition. TV and film obviously continue to revisit partition with newer, more fresher perspectives, and the contemporary relationship between the partition and discourse is also done through art. Um, and again, with this, I'd like to sort of get to the three research questions that I wanted to address was how do books, films, and digital media shape the public understanding of partition today? How have language and identity changed for partition survivors and their families over time? And how do people react to partition in films, literature, and social media? I will get to each of them in their own capacity, but most of what I'm going to be talking is going to be liquid. Yeah, so like I mentioned my research topics before. So the methodology that I used for the paper was a thematic analysis. So what I wanted to do was go through a lot of art and film. So I kind of divided my research into I kind of divided my research into two different sections. So one of it was tracking the evolution of द पार्टीशन जो कि मैंने मेरी लिटरेचर रिव्यू में कवर कर लिया था एंड आफ्टर दिस I did look at the thematic analysis through dividing my sections between books and dividing the other half of my section to film through films. And what I did was I started with engaging and sort of consuming these texts because that's kind of the first thing to do. And then I kind of labeled all of them into different segments. And after that, I sort of grouped the codes into broader themes. And then uske baad, I refined and validated the themes. And lastly, I defined the themes under a couple of different categories. And kind of grew my analysis based on how the thematic analysis came through. Another method that was very interesting was the critical discourse analysis. This I've mostly used for understanding social media because a lot of what happens there is hegemonic. And yeah. So, like I mentioned before, the evolution of narratives did start with separation and loss. So there was forced migration, there were broken families, and there were very complicated relationships that often used personal experiences as a metaphor for national divide. Again, with the train to Pakistan, and there's another book called Tamas, which is by Bhisham Sahni, that sort of portray a physical separation that's been caused by the partition. And through films, you can see that there's a film called Garam Hawa and there's Pinjar that sort of use families as a means to sort of spread the message on separation. So it also sort of shows how the Hindu, Sikh, and the Muslim communities kind of reacted. And again, there's a staple when it comes to the lost and found gaze that Bollywood tends to sort of echo and sort of keep reusing when it comes to the partition. And a lot of the folk songs and a lot of the oral histories that kind of came out to be did reflect on the longing for a lost homeland, particularly in Punjab and Sindh, where a lot of the folk music was a means to sort of preserve memories of pre-partition. So what we can come out, what we can derive out of this is the fact that partition not only divided land but also fractured relationships, communities, and the way people look at culture. Yeah, another very important theme when it comes to sort of understanding the partition is also going to be the fact that there was a constant war between identity and belonging because it completely disrupted the relationship that people had with their land itself, right? So um, this theme sort of stood out to me because it looked at displaced individuals, it looked at religion and conversation. So the River of Fire and Cracking India are very important for us to understand this because it kind of looked at how identities were imposed on people rather than asking them if they wanted to even choose those things. Films like Mammo and Refugee also sort of highlight how partition led to this statelessness and this void that with characters who I mean the characters in these films felt like outsiders because they wanted to sort of because they wanted to show how complex these things were. Veer and Zara is another film that kind of is a stereotype of how partition might be. Again, I will come to digital media as we sort of follow through, but again, younger generations are discovering partition through personal stories and memory projects. So obviously, the underlying message from this theme was that partition did impose artificial boundaries on people whose cultural, linguistic, and historical ties often sort of exceeded newly created borders. Um, and this brings me to the last theme, which is memory and politics. So, obviously, post-partition, the way history was written, the way people sort of looked at history was shaped by politicization. There were state narratives and communal tensions that made history be depicted the way it was. So, again, like a lot of stereotypical films with political undertones, like the Earth 1947, Gaddar, and Tamas had political undertones that did reinforce nationalist narratives into people. Again, coming up to government-controlled histories, so official histories in Indian and Pakistani textbooks sort of frame how the youth and the newer generations looked at the partition. So a lot of it is misrepresented. A lot of it is sort of villainizing the opposite end more than looking at what you've done. So it's that was becomes very interesting when it comes to looking at the government-controlled histories. Um, Oral histories and digital platforms. So projects like the 1947 Partition Archive does sort of challenge state-centric approaches because it goes on to bringing out more subjective experiences, especially of women and of lower caste communities. So the way a partition is sort of remembered and retold is deeply political, and different narratives compete with each other to define its legacy and to really understand how things have been represented. I think a very important way to sort of understand the partition is through music, because I feel like it's the only thing that has sort of been untouched by politics, especially with folk music. So I've also made a playlist through the things that I've seen. So I yeah, I mean I can send a link ताकि आप लोग सब ये scan करके सुन सके. And the entire thing about music is that even when it started, there were a lot of people that there were a lot of musicians that kind of captured the emotion of the partition. And if I were to come on the contemporary narrative side, recently there was a concert where Diljit Dosanjh is performing, where he calls up a fan on stage and gives her a pair of shoes to say that the borders were made by politicians and Punjabis are the same at the end of the day. And it does go on to say that there is this imagination of an alternative reality where India wasn't divided, where Punjab didn't sort of have to bear the brunt. Punjab and Bengal didn't have to sort of bear the brunt of the partition. So there are a lot of musical albums that sort of came through, but there's this one song called Madari which sort of uses irony and wit to explain the refugee experience, and it was recently discovered in London, and it sort of shows how South Asians outside the subcontinent are also helping to preserve shared musical heritage. Before we get into the rest of the partition, I'd like to play 1 minute of this music video because I feel like it's kind of like a contemporary approach on the partition, and it does have a broader message. It's by this Pakistani band called Baya, and the song is called Hum Nadan.
क्या आवाज समझ नहीं आ रही है इस पे
यशवी,
Oh,
आवाज नहीं है इसमें.
1 minute. Okay. I'm not able to sort of so the sound. 1 minute. Okay, I'll just forward this on the group if that's okay, because I'm also kind of running out of time. But essentially, what this video does is that it questions how naive were people when it came to fight for land and when it came to fight for this sense of belonging. Because at the end of the day, what humans need is a human to human connection. So यहाँ पे जो visual है ये भी depict करता है कि only because of land, only because of this idea that if we get our own sense of land, if we get our own sense of belonging, we're sort of going to be okay, and we're going to be happy. But the problems have not changed. The problems have still been the same. So it was probably our approach in questioning how we look at these things. So I think this video was very interesting. I'm so sorry I couldn't play it. There's some issue with the sound of playing this. So yeah. Moving on. So, like I mentioned before, art and social media are so important when it comes to sort of understanding the partition, right? So,
यशवी आप मेरी आवाज आ रही? तो आप कंक्लूड करेंगे ना,
हाँ,
तो हम बाकी क्वेश्चंस में आपकी चीजों को देख लेंगे.
sure. I'll finish in the next 2 minutes. That's fine.
Yes, yes, please.
ठीक है. Okay. Cool. So the visual reconstruction of memory. So art has been such an important tool when it comes to sort of understanding the partition. So I won't take much time, but I will say that this one art piece. It's called Chal Bulia Uthai Chalya, which is essentially the demarcation of a good immigrant. So ये एक interactive installation था जहाँ पे एक wooden boat पे एक metal की पेटी रखी हुई थी and it sort of is compared to like contemporary luggage and ये जो भी चीजें थी this belonged to the artist's late father. And what this was so powerful because it really captures the way people had to dislocate and sort of recoup because of the partition. And another very interesting art piece that I found was this, which essentially shows the way the violence broke out. It shows the way people were sort of pushed to see, and this also is like a demarcation of how a lot of the Indian soldiers post pre-partition were sent for World War II. But then the way I looked at it was by the time they would come back and by the time they could even settle into their homelands, things would get very complicated. And it's essentially just saying that things are never going to be the same because the reality is going to be very sort of short-lived. Okay, so social media has sort of become a new way to look at the partition because there are a lot of oral history projects. So let's say the partition archive. There's this other platform called the Sindhi Roots that sort of looks at how older generations experience the partitions, their experiences, how um, and how people sort of how newer generations are looking at the effect of the partition, right? So यहाँ पे you can see that there are a lot of positive responses when it comes to making this more receptive. So all in all, there hasn't been that much work on the representation of the partition on social media, but the sort of impact that's been created has been relatively positive. Okay, so this sort of brings me to the conclusion of my presentation, which essentially is about how the Indian front and the Pakistani front are kind of putting the way we live into boxes, right? So let's say you take War as a film from Pakistan. It's very stereotypical in terms of representing India, in terms of taking something out of it. But it's not like the Indians haven't shied away from themselves either. Ek Tha Tiger, there's a trilogy on this that kind of keeps villainizing Pakistan on its end. It keeps questioning how polluted people are from Pakistan who try to safeguard their nation by sort of making different kinds of relations with Indians. So it's this innocent Indian and this villainized Pakistani that's always been represented. The same thing with Gadar. The way it's represented is very nationalist. Even with Dastan, there were parts where I didn't realize that Sikhs were sort of represented like this in India because that's not how it's done. But it was very new for me to see कि यहाँ पे Sikhs को भी villainized way में represent किया है, which is true because both these experiences are shaped by that. But it's the only thing is that both the sides try to say that हम बेचारे हैं और आप बेचारे नहीं हो, but I don't think that people understand that both sides did have losses, and both sides did have both sides had different stories to it. Another thing that I wanted to mention before we go is Hira Mandi, which came out recently on Netflix. It's a film by Sanjay Leela Bhansali, who's a very big director here in India. But you see how under researched it was. So I saw like a couple of tweets, I saw like a couple of things that questioned that. This was, I mean, the way Hira Mandi sort of represented Lahore versus how things were was very different, which essentially points us in the direction of the lack of research that both sides are doing when it comes to the media representations. I think before I end, I just sort of wanted to reflect that um, why I did this project. So I feel like it shapes how we absorb and remember life-changing events in ways that are beyond our imagination. But it still continues to alter our lives. There is kind of a strong link between collective memory production and what we consume. And that kind of becomes the foundation of who we become. So partition and identity construction is very important because media plays such an important role for how generations are going to kind of remember the event. These are my references. Thank you so much. And just before we end, I just want to share this very interesting artwork, which is done by Reena Kalat in the installation of the Memories of Partition in the Manchester Museum. So what this does is this is the Wagha and Atari border, and this kind of shows the how we're so close but also so far, right? So the red in this kind of depicts the dhaga that's tied around Indian temples and Islamic mosques, and the whole thing is that we were united, and the threads kind of show how complex our relationship has become because of this. And it also hopes for peace between both India and Pakistan. And I think it's very powerful because it kind of also shows what we are doing here in Kalma. So I think that was very powerful. And yeah, thank you so much.
Very well done, Yashvi. मेरा ख्याल है लास्ट टाइम भी मैंने कहा था you are born professor. So again, thank you very much.